Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. We're really excited to have David Stokes here tonight talking about Camelot's Cousin. Without further ado, I want to introduce David and let him start the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And I understand Tom is in New York, and so we've had some interesting challenges seeing if we were able to pull this thing off. As you may know, New York was pretty severely hit by Hurricane Sandy. Well, I have been a writer for a number of years. I wear a number of hats. The main calling in my life is ministry. I'm a pastor, have been for 35 years. Next month is the 35th anniversary of my ordination. And along the way, of course, I've done a lot of radio broadcasting. I've written articles and columns and blogs and now a couple of books. And most of what I write is history or history in the news, which is the title of my current blog. And my first book, which, by the way, just came out this week, Random House released it, The Shooting Salvationist, in paperback. It came out hardcover in 2011, so it's out now in paperback. And it's a national true crime bestseller, according to the cover. And Wall Street Journal gave us that a couple of times. And Bob Schieffer of CBS News, who moderated the last debate, I hate to even bring up a presidential election, but he moderated the last debate. He wrote the foreword to it. And so that's there. You can find out about that at my personal site, davidrstokes.com. Camelot's Cousin is the subject du jour tonight. It is a novel. I have never really been a big fiction reader. I read a lot of books, and if you've ever seen pictures of my office, I have a pretty significant personal library. I also pay a lot of public library fines, so there's a lot of books along the way. And usually read nonfiction, history, that kind of stuff, and which is reflected in my articles and columns and in my first book. But I had this idea for a story, and if I do read novels, they're of the thriller kind of variety, you know, a lot of espionage. Probably my favorite novelist is Daniel Silva, and I think I have everything that he's written, and he releases about a book a year, seems to do pretty well with it. And I enjoy the genre and so forth, and I had this idea based on some stuff that I sort of found in my history reading from the Cold War. Now we back up a bit. I, of course, grew up during the Cold War. We just passed the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962, and I was privileged to be in an event with Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev, just a couple of weeks ago. I was a first grade student in October of 1962. We had a drill where we had to get under our desk, and we were told not to look at the flash. It was a pretty dangerous time, and I've always been interested in the Cold War. And so I got acquainted with someone local here in Northern Virginia some years ago, many years ago, Gary Powers. His father was Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot shot down in May of 1960. And Gary founded the Cold War Museum, which is a Smithsonian affiliate. And I got involved with this museum, this fledgling effort, and contributed some articles to the Cold War Times. And along the way, of course, developed a real fascination even before that with Cold War espionage. And the story of the Cold War really is a story not just of these big geopolitical things happening, you know, Kennedy and Khrushchev and the Soviets and the United States, but also it is a story of the behind-the-scenes stuff, the espionage stuff. I also grew up reading Mad Magazine. Maybe I don't like to admit that, but they always had that feature, Spy versus Spy. And every once in a while when I get in a funny mood, I'll put that Spy versus Spy icon as my profile picture on my Facebook page. So I've been fascinated with this stuff. Of course, the stuff of movies, the stuff of novels, classic stuff, John le Carre, and you can go all the way back, Frederick Forsyth, these writers. So I had this idea for a book that, based on some stuff I found, I actually discovered that there were some code names for spies, and there are spies that existed and operated during the Cold War that have never been identified. Every few years, you know, we start matching this. Oh, this guy was the third man, or he was the fourth man, or he was the fifth man. And I found a code word for a spy who had never been identified. We know that he was one of the Oxford spies. Now, the famous spies in Britain were the Cambridge spies, people like Kim Philby and Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean and Anthony Blunt, who really wreaked havoc in the 1940s and the 50s in their intelligence work for the Soviet Union. But lesser known was a group of spies recruited, communists recruited in the 1930s at Oxford University, the other big university over in the UK. And so I developed a fascination. Then I started reading. I probably, in my library, my gracious, I must have 150 nonfiction, and I think it's probably a conservative estimate, nonfiction books on the stuff of espionage and intelligence. And here's the cool thing. I live and minister in Northern Virginia, and so I get to work now and relate to people who actually work in these fields. It's been my privilege to be over to Langley several times. I've walked across that fabled seal in the lobby of the Central Intelligence Agency. I've seen the stars on the wall. I've even dined on the 7th floor, which is a pretty cool ticket. And so I've just really enjoyed being around that world. And so I came up with this idea for a spy novel. And it wraps in the Cold War. Obviously, the Camelot reference is a reference to the Kennedy years. A lot of people think that's what they were called then, but they weren't. It was actually a mythology, and I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily, but it was a deliberate contrivance after President Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, when a few weeks after the assassination, Jackie Kennedy was talking to the author Theodore White, who had written The Making of the President in the 1960s, a political historian, and talked about how President Kennedy enjoyed the Broadway musical and the music from the show Camelot, which was a big deal back in the early 60s. And as a result of that, that name affixed itself in hindsight on the Kennedy years. They're called the Years of Camelot. Bill O'Reilly's best-selling book right now, Killing Kennedy, The End of Camelot, it says. And so that's a reference to Kennedy, and obviously I deal with John F. Kennedy. I deal with the assassination. I give you a new conspiracy theory for the assassination in this novel. But all along, I tie it into things that actually happened. And you're going to be hard-pressed as you read this novel, and if you've read it, to figure out, did this actually happen or did you make this up? And that's the cool thing about writing fiction, because certainly the scenario I made up, but there's enough fact at it to make a lot of people have written me, and they've read it. They've read the ebook. They've read the paperback version. By the way, there should be on your screen a Buy Now button. If you don't have it at any time during this video chat, you can go there and either get it in ebook form at Amazon. It's $4.99 or $16.95 for the paperback version. And I would encourage you to do so. It's part of what we're trying to accomplish. Many of the people who are certainly participating have already read it, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions about this and hearing your comments in just a few moments. But this is a story that I've gotten emails and calls from people, and I've gotten notes. Did this really happen? How much of this is real? Do you really think so-and-so was a big spy? And so forth. And I delight in that because it means that I think I've done a fairly good job, possibly, of convincing people about the story. It's interesting. I wrote my first book, The Shooting Salvationist, J. Frank Norris, and the Murder Trial That Captivated America. And I used 6,000 pages of documents and court records and newspapers to create the narrative. Everything that's in quotes in that book comes from a published source or a written document, so it's not a novel at all, although people have told me it reads like a novel. I thought maybe when I was going to write fiction, and particularly the kind of fiction that I'd be drawn to, which would be more historical and political fiction, that it wouldn't require as much research. I actually found the research to be every bit as exacting to write this kind of fiction as it was for my nonfiction book. All in all, I hope it's a good read. I hope people have found it to be. I have lots of ideas in my head for other things that I want to write. I want to see how this particular project does. This is an obscure book from a relatively unknown author, though I've been on a bestseller list, certainly not for fiction. And so it's an uphill climb against all the big boys, But the best way to deal with anything is, of course, word of mouth. And so anything that you can do and other people can do to help spread the word about this book would be a great thing. Now, what I'd like to do, and the way I will answer questions will probably be a little bit more detailed, is I would like you to begin to think about something you'd like to ask if you've read the book or if you haven't read the book. About the process of writing, about the story itself, what is true, what's not true, where did you get that? Even in the back of the novel, unusual for a fiction book, I give a number of books that I gleaned material and color from that are actual books, and several times in the novel, by the way, people are, hey, they're reading a book and the guy reads a passage from a book. Anytime that happens, that's an actual published nonfiction work, and the quotes are verbatim. And so I build a circumstantial case that near the heart of the Kennedy administration, President Kennedy, there was a spy, a high-ranking official, who was a spy working for the Soviet Union near all the events of those years, from the Bay of Pigs to Kennedy's event in Vienna with Khrushchev to the Berlin Wall to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 50th anniversary of it just passed, and then even the Kennedy assassination itself. And it's fiction. A lot of people say that this was a great history book somebody read because it read like a novel. Well, this is almost a novel that reads a little bit like a history book, but don't let that turn you off because I hope I make it somewhat compelling. So what I'd like to do is take some time now, and you have a raise the hand button and an ask a question button. I don't know exactly how all the technology works. I'm in my office here at Fair Oaks Church in Fairfax, Virginia, and I am supported by Pastor Phil Bassam, our executive pastor, and Mike Zizolfo, our media pastor, and they're helping with the setup on this, and also Tom with Shindigg. I'm very grateful for them and the work they do in this area. This is something new that I'm trying, and it's something that we hope to expand into some other areas. So do you have any questions or comments if you've read the book or if you haven't read the book? And you don't have to have read the book. You can read the synopsis of it. If you have any questions or comments, I guess what do they do? Tom, raise their hand or ask a question? Is that how it works?
Exactly. So if you'd like to come up like I am here right now and ask David your question, just click the raise hand button. And if you'd prefer to ask your question via text, you can just click the ask a question button and type it in. One question that has come in, and wondering, from a writer's perspective, how difficult is it to weave the fact and the fiction, and is it sometimes surprising which is sort of less believable, some of the things that are facts and some of the things that are fiction?
It's very, very interesting because truth is, there's an old saying, truth is stranger than fiction. The weaving them together is hard to do. It's a very difficult thing to do seamlessly. Now, when I say history, get out of your mind the social studies class or the academic history that, I want to be every bit as exact on my history as that. But I am drawn to popular historians. If you like the work of David McCullough, for instance, who wrote John Adams, and he wrote the book about Harry Truman, and a number of others, the Johnstown Flood. He's a narrative historian who writes in a very readable way. Now, you know what? Academic historians blast him. He's not a real historian, because he's writing for popular culture. Well, he writes books that people actually read. And so when I talk about history, I'm not just talking about proving a point. Don Hewitt, who was for years, he was the one who created the model for 60 Minutes on CBS News. He was also the person who organized the first presidential debates back in 1960 between Kennedy and Nixon. They asked him the success of 60 Minutes a few years before he died, and he said it's 4 words: tell me a story. And he says it goes back to the days even of the Bible. the stories. Now, when you hear the word story, you may think of it in a fictitious way, but it's really a narrative. It's the process of something as it comes along. Now, weaving these things together is a challenge for the writer, and a lot of the challenge comes in the form of dialogue. And it was one of the most difficult things, I think, for me to learn. And I'm still learning it, how to write dialogue, conversational stuff, how to get inside someone's head in a character, a real-life historical character. If I have a meeting between President John F. Kennedy and Harold Macmillan, who at that time was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, I know in history from documents and from studies, the general things that were talked about, but, we don't have a transcript of private conversation. So how do you recreate that private conversation in a way that's believable? It's a great challenge, and I had to work at it. I was aided by a wonderful man in New York by the name of Bill Thompson. Bill Thompson is well into his 80s now. He's in retirement, but he every once in a while takes a liking to a new author, and he worked with me on my first book, and he's worked with me since. He's known in publishing circles, and I love to say this because he is the man who discovered Stephen King. When Stephen King was in a trailer, living in a trailer in Maine, he's the guy that persuaded the book people to publish King's first novel. He is also the man who discovered John Grisham. And so he's along the way helped a lot of authors, and I'm just one, but he helped me with the dialogue and the weaving in of history. In fact, it's interesting, when I first gave the book to him to look at, he thought that I was using a fictional mechanism to describe a nonfiction story. In other words, when I build a case of a certain person being a Soviet spy, he thought I believed he was a spy, and I was proving it through fiction. And I said, no, Bill, I made it all up. But I knew at that point that I was onto something, and I certainly hope that's the case. Anyone else?
That's really interesting, David. We actually have Jim, who is coming up next, so I will bring Jim up to ask his question.
Hi, David. First of all, a great book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. Can't really come up with any profound questions other than how did you come up with digging a hole in the middle of nowhere to bury the dog and finding the treasure?
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy, for that question. It's interesting because, again, the weaving together of fact and fiction. In my reading about Cold War spies, I came across the story of a very real spy who was working here in the United States. He was actually a British official, and he was asked to leave this country under suspicion of being a Soviet spy in 1951. And years and years later, he defected to the Soviet Union about 12 years after this, and sort of proved that he was a spy after all, even though he had denied it. And a few years later after that, he wrote a book, which was a memoir that was published in the West about his nefarious activities. And in this memoir, he talks about just before he left America, how he had to go out and bury all of his spy paraphernalia, cameras and different things like this. And he talks about the area that he buried it, and it's in Northern Virginia, but the area that I choose is a little bit different. But when I read that, I thought, I wonder whatever happened to that stuff. To the best of my knowledge, that stash has never been found, but I found it in the fictitious medium in the course of the story of a father trying to dig a hole in his yard. He had a lot of acres to bury the family pet, and he finds this briefcase that contains a spy camera and all sorts of stuff, and even a journal with some cryptic wording in it. And there the story goes from there.
Well, it worked. It worked well.
So it's a true thing that happened, but I take it and make a fictional story out of it. There actually was stuff buried somewhere in Northern Virginia that, to the best of my knowledge, has never been found, but I took it from there. Thanks for the question, Jim.
Hi, David. Trina is coming up next, so I'm going to bring her up now.
Hi, Trina.
Hi. I think I have a little delay, so sorry if I'm not getting everything right away. But I loved the story, and I thought it was so believable. So when I got to the end, I went and looked up the guy that you had named as the spy, codename Bunny.
Mm-hmm.
I was so interested, to see what he was really like. And I was wondering, and I don't want to give away the name of the guy, but I was wondering if you had any obstacles to naming him in your book fictionally as a possibility. Did you have to contact his family, or were you concerned that, like, the descendants might get offended that you named him as a spy?
Yeah, it was a very good question. In some of the early editorial stuff that I did with Mr. Thompson, he was of the opinion that I should mask the name to make it somewhat similar. For instance, if anybody out there watches Boardwalk Empire, which is an HBO series about Atlantic City, the lead character is a character by the name of Nucky Thompson. Well, Nucky Thompson, this is a character based on a man who was actually called Nucky Johnson, but for the purposes of this drama, they changed the name for whatever reason, and I'm assuming sensibilities or whatever, and also they can take dramatic license. But it's very clear that when a person is in the public domain and a public figure, and we're talking about people who have all deceased now, and many of their descendants have deceased, and I don't anticipate this being the kind of blockbuster that would even be on their radar, but that would be interesting if it was. I make it very clear in the front matter and the back matter of the novel that this is a story I've made up. And you'll find in historical fiction, particularly political fiction, that oftentimes real-life characters are, their real names are used, but they're created and they're dealt with in a different way because there's an alternative history, there's an alternative story that's playing out. And so I felt comfortable in doing this, especially since I had the caveat there at the beginning and the end. But it was a bit of a concern at one point. I think if it was somebody alive today and well known in the public eye, I think that would be a different thing, and you might want to mask it. I actually think by not masking it, I think it makes for a better story. Good question, Trenna.
All right, we have a question from the audience here. Amber is wondering, what was your favorite part of the story to write and why? And are there any major parts that are based on your life?
Favorite parts of the story, I would put parts as opposed to in one part, would be the historical stuff. I got to tell you, I had a lot of fun digging into the various meetings between public figures and trying to describe those with a measure of historical accuracy in the context of a fictional story. That was my favorite, and I think that suggests that that's still where my heart is as far as where writing is to write history and get the history right. So the dynamics, for instance, between President John F. Kennedy and his brother Bobby, the Attorney General, the dynamics between President Kennedy and his counterpart in Great Britain, Harold Macmillan, and I have a flash, go back to the 1930s when Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, was the ambassador to the court of St. James to Great Britain from the United States, 38, 39, 40. And Jack Kennedy and his brother Joe and his sister Kathleen, they're all, in London living during these exciting times and attending parties and so forth, interacting, and then they meet up with this other network of people, and that story carries forward. I enjoyed writing those the most, I think. As far as me, I do broadcasting, but I am not Templeton Davis. He's a much smarter guy than I am. He also weighs significantly less than I do. Certainly, his wife died, and if my wife's watching this, that's not certainly my wish. And so, no, there's not a lot of me in that. I do get that question from a number of people because, most first books, there's an autobiographical element to it. And I don't think it's me. I just think I reflect my comfort zone to create a character who does something, and I get him involved in espionage. I'm not in the intelligence world, so he couldn't be or in the military world, he couldn't be a Navy SEAL or a former. I don't know enough about that environment, but I do know broadcasting. And so I built the character around that. So to that extent, it's a reflection of my interest and my life experience.
So I'm sure you get this question a lot, and someone's wondering what your personal beliefs on the assassination are, and what you think happened that day.
Well, sometimes I humorously answer this question, and I don't mean to poke fun at the death of anyone, that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy of angry husbands. But certainly that's not the case. I take it a different way in the book, so what I'm about to say is not in the book. But my personal belief about the Kennedy assassination is that there are so many unanswered questions, which does give rise to the various conspiracy theories about it. And there are so many nefarious connections, and direct or indirectly, between the Kennedys at the end of the 1950s, into the 60s, and organized crime, going back to the days of Kennedy's father. And so if there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and if Oswald was, as he claimed on the day that he was arrested, a patsy, and that's an open question, obviously, and you can read a number of books on this, and some of the conspiracy theories are quite outlandish. The latest one is a book out saying Lyndon Johnson had it done. That's just crazy talk. But if it was a conspiracy, there's only one group in culture that has successfully been able to keep those kinds of secrets. I mean, Watergate proved that politicians can't keep secrets. But we know one group keeps secrets pretty well. All you have to do is think of the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, and you realize we still don't know that, and pretty much everybody thinks it was a mob hit. And so I think if it was a conspiracy, there's probably an element of the mafia. If you know your history, you know that there was a lot of back stuff in Illinois, the election in 1960, a lot of questions about voter fraud. Nixon chose not to challenge that. It was one of Nixon's finest moments, by the way. And then, of course, Nixon, or I should say Kennedy, and Sam Giancana, who was a mob boss, shared the same girlfriend. Now, that's pretty, you think about this. Think of the security threat to the country when you have the President of the United States having an extramarital affair with the mistress of a mob leader while the President's in office. And that's well documented. This is not outlandish stuff. Also, the mob felt that Kennedy, they helped Kennedy get elected, and then when Bobby Kennedy went full throttle against organized crime, they felt a sense of betrayal. So if there was a conspiracy, and it could very well have been that Oswald was just, as Bill O'Reilly makes the case in his book, killing Kennedy, just this guy just happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. But there are too many questions. The one conspiracy theory area I reject out of hand is this whole notion that the CIA had Kennedy killed, and that Oswald was working for the CIA. I have too much respect for people who have served in various levels of intelligence in this country to think anything of that sort could go on. But a lot of interesting questions are raised along the way.
Another question, wondering if you've gotten to meet many of the Kennedys through your research for the book.
No, never have. I actually never have interacted with any of the Kennedy family. I have interacted with the Nixon family. I've worked a number of years with the Nixon Foundation. I have done voice work, and I only bring that up because it sort of connects. Nixon and Kennedy are sort of thought of together during that epic time, and I did the voice work for this past year. Pat Nixon would have been 100 years old, so the Nixon Library had a new video done. I did the voice work for that, and I've met Julie and David Eisenhower, Julie being Nixon's daughter and David Eisenhower being President Eisenhower's grandson. as well as Edward Cox, who's married to Tricia Nixon. But no, none of the Kennedys did I ever meet. And they're an interesting group of people. I grew up with a great deal of fascination. My first history books were purchased. My dad got them at the A&P store in Taylor, Michigan, where I grew up. I think you had to buy so many boxes of dish soap or something like that, and you got free history books. What a cool thing it was for me. And I read them. They were forwarded by President Kennedy. I had great respect for him, and I remember the day he died being very, very upset that this person that I admired was killed.
So a little bit of a topic shift, but someone mentioned that they saw in the blurb that you have written for the Journal of U.S. Intelligence Studies, and we're wondering what exactly you wrote for that, and if there's a way to read that piece.
Yes, there is. In fact, it's interesting. I just actually went back to that piece today. It actually appeared, I think, in 2009. It's called The Intelligencer. It's the Journal of U.S. Intelligence Studies put out by a group called AFIO, A-F-I-O, the Association of Former Intelligence Officers. And this is a group that provides support for retirees and so forth from the CIA and other such agencies. And I wrote a piece for the Nixon Foundation on the Berlin Tunnel. I got to attend. Let me back up here. I got to attend through my friendship with certain people in certain places. I get to go to some of these history things the CIA does, and I went to Georgetown a few years back when the family of Richard Helms, and he had been a CIA director under Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, donated his papers to Georgetown University. And so I went as a guest of an official and enjoyed it very much. Henry Kissinger was there, historian Michael Beschloss was there, and a number of former spies were there, including a man by the name of William Hood. And William Hood was asked what one of the greatest successes of the Cold War in intelligence was, and he said, the Berlin Tunnel. So I got to studying the Berlin Tunnel, and I wrote a piece for the Nixon blog on the story of the Berlin Tunnel. The Tunnel Time Forgot, I called it. This is a tunnel in 1956 that was placed underneath Berlin between east and west, and it was designed to tap into their telephones. And it was betrayed by a spy who was in the news yesterday in the United Kingdom. He's 90 years of age. His name is George Blake. He lives in the Soviet Union now, but he was a traitor. He was a Brit who was a traitor. He was captured by the North Koreans during the Korean War, and while he was there, the communists turned him. You talk about the Manchurian Candidate. They turned him, and he went to working for the communists, and he became a very, very notorious Soviet spy. And so I noticed that and I read a whole bunch of papers, and I was reading in the Daily Mail in London yesterday. And I noticed a story about this guy was interviewed in Russia on his 90th birthday about all of his nefarious activities. And so I put a blog on my blog, historyinthenews.com. If you go to davidrstokes.com or historyinthenews.com, you'll see this story about this spy. And in it, I mentioned this article, The Tunnel Time Forgot, that I wrote for the Nixon blog. After it was in the Nixon blog a few days, I got a call from the editor of The Intelligencer, the Journal of U.S. Intelligence Studies, which is a pretty prestigious journal, asking for their permission to print, or my permission to print my article in that journal. And I was very excited about that, and it's one of the nice things to have happened to me in my writing. So that's how that came to be.
All right. Unless anyone has any more questions, I think that is all we have right now.
Yep, that's it. That's great. Thank you.
Someone would like to raise their hand for one last question. All right, David, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up tonight?
Just thank everybody for showing up, and this is an interesting format. I really enjoyed this discussion. And if you've read my book, tell other people about it, send them to the website, put it on your Facebook page. it's a long uphill climb. If you've read my book and you've read Bill O'Reilly's book, write a review for Bill O'Reilly's book on Amazon.com, and in the first paragraph mention, by the way, I also read Camelot's Cousin, and link them together. I'd love to have this book linked to that bestseller. Shameless promotion, that's what that's about. Tom, thanks for your help.
And sure thing. Thanks so much for being here, and it was a really fascinating discussion. And in the spirit of promotion, definitely click on the link here in the upper right-hand corner to order the book from Amazon, and hope everyone has a great evening. Thanks so much for coming, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.